All right, let's take our Bibles together, please. And we will open up to James chapter 1 today. Thanksgiving coming, what's the purpose? The purpose is to stop our lives, screech it to a halt, and say, you know what? We need to stop and give thanks. Because it's far too easy to just race through life and take all that we get from God and just gobble it up and enjoy it and then move on without stopping and thanking. And one of the real ironies of that is, can you think of a busier day in your church or your year's calendar than Thanksgiving? You have to usually travel to a relative, and then you're preparing meals all day, and then there's parades on the TV, and there's football on the TV, and then there's all the cleanup. And by the end of the day, you didn't have time to barely look up to God, let alone stop and give thanks. Make sure that doesn't happen to you this year. Make sure you can either at the beginning or at the end or somewhere, just stop and genuinely give thanks to God for what He's done. And in fact, in my daily life, I've been trying to make it a habit, and I want to continue it to the end of my life, is just before I go to bed, just take 10 or 15 minutes and just reflect on what went well that day and thank God for it. It'd be like having, when you wives and mothers make a beautiful meal for your family, they just gobble it up and walk away, without saying thanks to you. And I think we do that to God a lot. And I do that to God a lot. And I just want to make sure that that's something I fix. And make sure this Thanksgiving you really find a moment to really stop and give thanks to God for what He's done. As I said, the reason we need Thanksgiving like this and times like this is because it's far too easy to let all the suffering of life grab a hold of us. There's so many things, so many problems in this world. There's money problems that we're constantly juggling with. There's health problems that always seem to be right around the corner. There's family problems and personal problems and marriage problems and economy, the national economy, the moral problems of our nation, which just seem to be sliding darker and darker and darker. And it's so easy, especially because the news has it right in your face all the time, all the things going wrong. It's so easy for all those sufferings to grab hold of us. And we got to shake loose of that. If we let the sufferings of this life grab hold of us, we're going to become one of two types of people. One is we're going to become fearful, depressed people because things are just so bad. Or the opposite, we can become angry, outraged people who are just agitated all the time by all the things that are messing up life. As I go about, I find that most people fall into one of these two categories. I don't know about you, but I find that. They're either afraid or they're angry. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a third type of person that we could be in the sufferings, and that is joyful people? Wouldn't that be nice? It'd be crazy because there's so much going wrong, but it'd be nice. In the verses in front of us, God says it isn't just something that would be nice. In the verses that we're looking at this morning, God commands us to be this third type, to be the joyful people. Look at probably one of the most well-known verses in the Bible, verse 2, James 1:2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, temptations, problems, sufferings, the bad parts of life, consider it all joy. God commands us to be joyful people in the midst of the sufferings of this world. God commands that there. I'm not sure we take that really seriously. Someone said this is the most disobeyed verse in the Bible. Right? Probably. Because how often do we experience or choose joy, feel joy, when the sufferings of life are coming upon us? It's just not a natural thing to do. And yet God commands us to be people that are known for joy. He says, I know this world is filled with all sorts of terrible suffering. He says, I know that, but I don't want you to be fearful people, and I don't want you to be angry people. I want you to be joyful people as you suffer. That doesn't mean you won't suffer, but it means as you suffer, I want you to be people known for their joy. And the question for all of us, the question for you this morning is, are you known as a person of joy in the midst of all the things that are going wrong? God doesn't just suggest that that would be nice. God says, I command you, be known for your joy. And of course, the question is how? And that's what the sermon is about. The sermon is going to be looking at God's 3 commands for us for times of suffering. God's 3 commands for us for times of suffering. And you might be there right now this morning, really suffering something that you can't even tell the rest of us about. It's so personal and it's so deep. Maybe it's been going on for years. Maybe it happened this morning. But you're suffering. God says, I have 3 commands for you. And if you follow these 3 commands, you will be able to truly feel joy in your suffering. It won't make the sufferings go away, but it means as you're suffering, you can be a person who has a bright spot of joy to focus on. And that can happen. Wouldn't you like that to happen? We don't want our sufferings of life just overwhelm us and just make everything dark. They're going to be there, but God says you can have a reason for joy in that as well. And that's what this passage is about. So I thought this is a good passage to go over. We all know these verses. The question isn't if we know them, it's if we're living them. And that's what this sermon's about. How to live this very difficult command that God has given us and truly have thanksgiving even in the midst of suffering. All right, so today, God's 3 commands for times of suffering. Let's begin. Verse 1 introduces us to the readers who originally heard this command, the very first ears to hear these commands through James from God. God is speaking to these people. Let's find out who these people are. James 1:1. James, a bondservant, that means slave. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. To the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. Greetings. All right, so are these words, were they originally directed to? We're reading someone else's mail here. And the people here were Jews who would have been raised in Israel. They would have been living under the Old Testament law of Moses. They would have gone many times a year to the temple in Jerusalem and worshipped there. And they would have been waiting for the Messiah, the long-promised king from the Old Testament who would come and rule and reign over the world forever and ever. That's who these people were. And then one day they heard about Jesus Christ, who said he was the king. And they received him. The readers of this letter are Jewish Christians who heard about Jesus, received him, and now where are they living? If you look at the verse there, it says they are now scattered among the nations, dispersed abroad. They're not living in Israel. They're not living in the land that they grew up in. They're not in their homes that they should have. They're not among their family and neighbors that they would like to be at. Why? Because of other non-believing Jews who felt that turning to Jesus was treachery, and so they persecuted these Christians, and the Christians had to run for their lives. And now they're living outside the land they love and the homes they know and away from their families. They're living outside of all that, and they're suffering. Imagine that you today, because you chose Christ, you can no longer live in your house or in this area. You have to move to another area where you don't know anybody, and you'd rather not be there. You want to be where you belong. That's what these people were going through, and they were suffering. And God in his love and compassion looks down on these people who have left what they love to stay loyal to him. And he has a message for them. What does he say to them? Well, he begins by telling them what to feel. He tells them 3 things. The first is what to feel. Look at verse 2 again. Now, given all that, they're suffering, they're away, they're lonely, they've been persecuted. Here's what he says to these people in compassion. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. What is God saying to them? He's telling them how they're supposed to feel. In their misery, in their loneliness and isolation, he's telling them how they should feel, and this is in your insert. Number 1, how they should feel is they should feel joy. They should feel joy. They're separated from their homes and their family and the country that they loved, and they aren't feeling joy. But God says, I know you're suffering, and I know you're in pain, And I know what I'm saying will not remove the loneliness and the distance and the rejection that you're experiencing, but I'm telling you there's a reason for you to feel joy in the midst of your darkness right now. And it's the same thing that God says to you and me today. As I said, you might have gone through something that's really a bad suffering. We've all been through sufferings in this life. Sometimes we've experienced, some of us here, sufferings that have knocked you down on your hands and knees like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, that it's been so bad. And I don't know if you might be there this morning. But what God is telling us in love and compassion, just like he told these people, he's speaking to all of us here today, and he's saying, I know it's dark, and I know it's terrible, and I know it's painful, but I'm telling you, there is a reason for you to have joy as you are suffering. Your problem doesn't have to disappear before you can know joy. You can know joy right now in your suffering. That's the first thing. He commands them. He commands us. I want you to feel joy in your situation. And then the obvious question is, well, how? How do we feel joy? His first command is joy. How do we feel joy? And he goes on to explain in the next verse, because of something that we know. You're in misery. I want you to feel joy because of something that you know. Look at the first word of verse 3. What is the first word? Knowing. The NIV says, because you know. In other words, you're separated from your family, your home country, your loved ones. You're aliens in a foreign place you'd rather not be. I know it's dark. I know it's terrible. But I'm giving you something to know so that you can have joy. What is that thing to know? It's the same thing that he says to you and me. You and I might be going through very dark, miserable, suffering times right now, but he's saying, I'm going to share with you something that you can know that will allow you to feel real joy, not fake joy, put on a happy grin and bear it. That something I'm going to tell you to know that can actually make you feel joy in the midst of your pain. What is it? Well, it's the great truth about suffering. What is the great truth about suffering? Think of Job for a minute. Think of the loss that Job had in his life and all the things that went wrong for him and how miserable and suffering he was. Think of him in the midst of that, on his hands and knees, crying out in misery because of what's going on. Now, he's right in the middle of that story. We know the end, right? We've read the story of Job hundreds of times. We know how it ends for Job. He's lost all of his wealth. He's lost all of his health. He's lost his dear children. But we know how it ends. Take Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph finds himself in prison. Absolute the lowest point he can get. He's in misery and sorrow and it's dark for him. But we know how it ends for him, right? We know that he was betrayed by his brothers who should have been loyal to him. We know that he was lied about and now is in prison. It's dark and it's miserable, but we know how it ends for him. And if you and I could have met those men at their darkest moment, wouldn't we have run up to them and say, look, it's terrible, it's dark, we're not going to pretend it's not for you, but you don't know how this ends. You, Job, you're going to have all your wealth come back double. What you lost will be replaced 2 times more. Your health is going to completely come back, and you're going to have a whole new family of kids, double the amount of kids once you get to heaven. So it's all going to end well for you, Job. And we'd run up to Joseph and we'd say, Joseph, I know it's really dark and terrible and miserable right now, but it's going to end really well for you. You're going to be released from prison, and you're going to become the second most powerful man of the number 1 world superpower nation. And you're going to be reunited with your family, and you're going to have a wonderful family of your own, and it's going to end on just great crescendo of triumph in your life. We would run and tell them, it's all going to end well. We know how it ends. They didn't know how it ends. We would tell them it would all end in great good. Wouldn't you? I would tell them that. And do you think that would make a difference of how they faced that really dark moment? Sure. It wouldn't change the fact that Joseph's in prison or that Job's in misery, but it would give them a little bit of glimpse of hope and a reason for joy because they knew that great good was coming. And that's exactly what God rushes to our side to tell us through this passage today. He rushes to you and me. He rushed to these people here dispersed around the world. He rushes to you and me and he says, I know how this is going to end. And for you, it's really dark and it's miserable and it's terrible, but I'm telling you, it's going to end in great good. That doesn't remove your misery, but it does give you a glimmer of hope and a reason to actually be joyful. It's not going to end like this. It's going to end in great good. And that is what God says to you this morning, too. The great truth about suffering. Now let me ask you, what do most people believe about suffering? If you asked the person on the street and stopped them and said, what do you think is suffering? What do you think they'd say? I think they'd say something like this. Wrong one. There we go. I think most people would say suffering ruins my life. Don't you think? Yeah, no one's going to say, yeah, I think suffering makes me a better person. No, suffering takes life, which is already difficult, and makes it harder. So suffering ruins my life. I would say most people would agree with that. Suffering ruins my life. I'm going along just fine, and then someone steals some belongings from me. I'm going along just fine, and an illness comes and puts me, on the edge of being able to cope. I'm going along just fine, and someone betrays me who should have been loyal to me, just like with Joseph and Job. And that just ruins my life. That's what suffering does. And as long as you view suffering this way, do you think you're going to have joy? No. You're going to be either a fearful person or an angry person if you believe this about suffering. But what if we changed our definition of suffering and said this isn't the definition of suffering? When we become Christians, we change the definition of death, don't we? We go through our lives raised. Death is the end. It's miserable. It's over. It's hopelessness. It's dark, and everything ends. But you become a Christian, and you realize that's not the definition of death. We redefine it. We define it as magnificence. Being on the other side means glory and brilliance and beauty and joy and never suffering again. The dying process is miserable most of the time. But death, that transfer, becomes something great. We redefine death when we become Christians. We need to do the same thing about suffering when we become Christians. I don't think we tend to do that as often as we do with death, the redefinition. I think that most of the time, my observation is that we keep the same definition of suffering that we had before we were Christians, that suffering ruins my life. But God is trying to teach us, no, you can't have joy in suffering if you keep this definition. The new definition is this: suffering can bring great good to my life. That's the view that we should have of suffering as Christians. That's what this passage teaches. Suffering isn't something that automatically ruins your life. Suffering is something that can bring great good to your life. Not great good to your life. Joseph was one of these who had this belief. Remember, his brothers come to him and they say, we're really sorry for what we did way back when. And he said to them, Genesis 50, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. He said, you intended this to ruin my life. That's why you did this to me. But God created great good out of it. He kept this second definition, and it kept him going. And it gave him joy in the midst of sorrow. And it's the same thing that God wants for you and me when we have our sorrow in the sufferings of life. If we changed our belief about death, we need to also change our belief about suffering. And we all know this. I'm not saying anything that you probably haven't heard many, many, many times. Suffering can bring great good. But I don't think, my observation is that we tend to live there. We know it, but we don't tend to really live it. And God says, I want you to live it. This is God's second command for our times of suffering. The number one is, I want you to feel joy. Number two, it's because of something you know. Here's your insert. Because of something that you know, that great good can come through suffering. Great good can come through suffering. Now, any specific great good, or is it just kind of, you got to wait and see? There is a specific great good. that comes through suffering. Look at verse 4. It says, "And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. How many here are perfect and complete, lacking in nothing? How many here are imperfect, incomplete, and lacking in lots and lots of ways? Yeah, right. How does it make you feel when you act immature? Rachel found that funny. Now you're going along and you have a bad reaction, and then you go, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have, expressed myself in that terrible way. You act immature, or your flaws just fly out of you, or your failures, flaws, failures, problems, yeah. We don't feel really good. We feel embarrassed, and we feel ashamed, and we hate that about ourselves. What if I could take you today, and I drove you out to a little spot, and there was a little gate and a path that kind of disappeared over the hill. And I said, come to this gate, and I'm telling you something that's absolute truth. If you walk through this gate and follow that path to the very end, you will no longer have any flaws, problems, failures, immaturity in your life. They'll all be gone, and you'll be a complete and perfect, lacking in nothing. Would you walk through that gate? Would you go down that path? Would you say, yeah, I'm going? I think we might be scared out of our minds what is on the other side of that hill, but wouldn't you want to find a way to fix every problem that you have, every flaw, every failure, everything you're ashamed of and everything you're embarrassed about that pops out every now and then, and just things you hate about yourself that you've been trying to conquer for years and you can't conquer it? And all you'd have to do is walk through that gate and follow it to the end, and it would happen. It would truly happen. Wouldn't that be wonderful? God says that's the path of suffering. Because as I'm telling you, there is that path. And you walk along that path just about every single day. Sometimes it's because you clip your fingernails too short and they end up hurting for the rest of the day, and that's suffering. Sometimes you lose a loved one who is really close to you. Sometimes you get cancer. And sometimes you get a paper cut. But just about every day we suffer in some way. And God is telling you, I have a plan for that suffering to lead you to a really good place where it fixes your flaws and perfects your character. That's the great good that God wants to lead us to, fixing our flaws and perfecting our character. Each one of us, when we become Christians, we show up the first day of the Christian life just full of problems, right? No one walks into the Christian life saying, here I am, and I really don't need much fixing. We all need terrible amounts of fixing. Building of our character. As we said before, God isn't interested in just saving our souls. He's interested in saving our character, in making you just like Him, in the way you think, in the way you value, in the way you behave. That's God's goal for you, not just to get you out of hell. No. To get you just like Him in His character. So what builds character? Wouldn't it be wonderful if ease and comfort built character? Wouldn't it be wonderful? You just lay on your couch and you just become better and better and better, and you watch TV and you just become better and better and better and just enjoy yourself? It doesn't work that way, does it? What is it that builds character in your life and my life as you look back? It was the hard times, right? Very rarely is it the easy times. It's the sufferings of life that build character. That doesn't mean we have to seek suffering. God doesn't want us to seek suffering. It's perfectly right and natural to avoid suffering in life. But God says when suffering comes, you can let that pull you down into a terrible, dark, miserable place because it feels terrible, dark, and miserable. And maybe a terrible tragedy that's going on. But He says there is a reason to have joy in the midst of your suffering because of what you know. And that is, this can lead to great good that will fix my flaws and perfect my character. And in the midst of crying, you can say, yeah, there is that bright light in this darkness that I can focus on. Every single time. No exception. You can have the death of your dearest, closest friend. You can be in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. You can have the most miserable, horrible situation going on, and this still applies. That God says you can have great good that fixes your flaws and perfects your character in this terrible situation right now. And that's a reason to be joyful, though. It never gets completely dark. There's always that light there. And that's why he says to be joyful. Think about a suffering that you're going through. And I'm not going to minimize the pain of it at all. It might be even hard to think about this suffering. But think about a suffering you face. And then see if you can say this with me. Let's read this together. My suffering can bring the great good of fixing my flaws and perfecting my character. Do you believe that about that particular suffering you're thinking about? God tells us this to believe it. I want you to feel something, joy, because of something that is true to know. And that is your suffering can bring great good. Yes, your suffering. Fixing your flaws and perfecting your character. And there are other good things, too, that God promises. But this is the one this passage talks about. Now, if this is true, and everybody suffers, then why isn't everybody just getting better and better? All our flaws being fixed, all of our characters being built until we just go, 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 and look at us all. Why, if this is true, isn't everyone just getting better and better? And you probably know the answer, because this doesn't happen automatically. Fixing our flaws and building our character depends on something. And that's God's third command. God's third command in his list of what to do in times of suffering. It's the last, actually the last word of verse 3. Do you see the last word of verse 3? It'll be a different word depending on your translation. In my translation, it's the word endurance. It might be patience in yours. It might be perseverance. They all mean the same thing. Look at verse 4. It says, and let endurance, or patience or perseverance, have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Okay, this is telling us, in order for us to get the good out of suffering, there's something we have to add to our suffering. Okay, it doesn't happen automatically. If you just ride along and suffer and don't add this particular thing, you won't get the great good. Now, what is it that most people add to their suffering when they're going through it? Suppose you go home and you find that thieves have gone through your house and taken all the things that are valuable. What would most people add as they walk in the door and they found that happen? They would probably add cursing, swearing, yelling, revenge, anger, outbursts, rage. Yeah, that's what most people would add to their suffering. Suppose you suffer an illness that just has you on the very edge of wanting to die. Okay, it's that severe and that painful. What would most people add in that situation to their suffering? Again, shaking your fist at God, anger, or depression and misery and just giving up and fear. And that's what most people would add to their suffering in those type of situations. Here, this verse 4, the last word of verse 3, is telling us what God says we need to add to suffering, and we will experience great good. And it's the word, in my translation, perseverance, endurance, perseverance, patience. What is perseverance? We need to add it to your suffering. But what is perseverance? One of the people that we think in the Bible who persevered was Job. And again, Job is going along, he's living a godly life, and God blesses him because of his godly life with making him the richest man in his part of the world. Okay. Job was the Elon Musk of his time. The richest man. Okay. And then Satan says, well, of course this man is following you because you've treated him wonderfully. You treat him badly, he's going to turn on you. He's not going to follow you. So God says, in his perfect wisdom, I give you permission to be able to bring suffering into this man's life. And so in one day, Job wakes up and he hears that all of his children have died. And that all his enormous wealth is gone. All of it. What did Job add to that suffering? Because you know that drove him to his knees. He fell on his hand and on his face on the ground and just cried out in pain. What did Job add to his suffering? Number one, it says that he didn't curse God, but that he blessed God. Number two, it says that he didn't forsake God, but that he said, look, God has every right. God gave me blessings, and God has every right to take away those blessings. In other words, what did Job add to his suffering? Here's horrible suffering. Job, what do you add? Job added obedience. Just that one ingredient. I'm suffering horribly, but I'm not going to add disobedience. I'm going to add obedience. And that made all the difference. That's what perseverance is. Perseverance is obeying God while suffering. Patience. Endurance is obeying God while suffering. It's suffering, well, here's one way to put it. Suffering plus disobedience. What's that going to accomplish? No good. It's going to come from that. But you endure, the definition of endurance, perseverance, suffering plus obedience. That brings great good. That's it. Why doesn't everyone who suffers get better and better and better? Because most people take option one here. I'm suffering, and I'm going to respond and add to this suffering disobedience. And there's 100 different ways you can add disobedience. We all know them. We've all practiced most of them. And the people around us are constantly doing that. But God says, if you will stop, slam the brakes on before you add anything to suffering and think, okay, I'm going to add obedience, just that one ingredient. It's like a recipe. It's totally lost. And you could say, but there is one thing that I could add, and it'll save the whole thing. That's what God is telling us here. You add obedience after you suffer. Terrible suffering, can't stop that most of the time. Now I'm going to add obedience, and great good, not might come, will come, it says. It will come. You will fix your flaws, perfect your character, and great good will come out of this terrible situation. And that's something to be joyful about. Really joyful about. Because I mean, it's not as dark and stay dark. It's dark, but there's a glimmer of light. And if you add obedience, that light will come into your life for sure. That's why God says we can be joyful. This is the third command that God gives us for times of suffering. In your insert there. What are we to do? There's something to feel, joy. There's something to know that great good is possible. And there's something to do, and that is add obedience to your suffering. That's what God is saying. That's what enduring means, adding obedience to your suffering. So, you get up and you go to work tomorrow. You're in a pretty good mood, and someone out of the blue curses at you. You did nothing to deserve this. They're just in a foul mood, and they decided to land on you, and that hurts. Don't minimize it. Yes. You're being cursed at, called a terrible name. It hurts, and now you get a choice to make. What are you going to add once that suffering enters your life? Number one, you can add disobedience. You can curse back. You can make a rude hand gesture at them. You can decide to get back at them somehow, snub them, treat them badly. You can do all sorts of disobedient things. Where's that going to end? More misery. You're just suffering, and you increased it. Instead, you can take option number two. I'm experiencing suffering, and you just hit the brakes, and you take a deep breath, and you dig deep, and you choose obedience. I'm going to respond by adding obedience to the suffering. What would you add? If you ever wondered, just think, what are the fruit of the Spirit? Because that's God. What would God add? Oh, love that treats that person well anyway. Kindness. Patience. self-control. That's the way to respond. And God says, the moment you do that, you have just added great good to your life. Just like that. You've fixed a flaw and perfected your character. And you've taken a dark thing and you've made it better because you added one ingredient to the recipe. You added obedience. Can you do that? Sure you can do that. But it's not easy. You got to restrain yourself. And you may have to force yourself to do the right thing because the natural and easy thing to do is to add disobedience. The unnatural but supernatural thing to do is to add obedience. And God says, do it. You can do it. And if you do it, it will get better. Imagine your spouse does that thing that really irritates you again. You probably say, which one? There's so many. But think of that thing that they do on a regular basis, and you've asked them 1,000 times not to do it. And maybe they've said, oh, okay, or maybe they haven't taken it seriously, but whatever it is, they've done it again. And you are now suffering because of something they forgot or didn't do or didn't really intend to, and they don't seem even very sorry that they did it. Now you're suffering. You get a choice of what you're going to add to that suffering. You can add disobedience, which is the easy, natural, don't even have to think about it thing to do. Yell, outbursts of anger, or just, total depression and giving up and hysterics and whatever it might be. There's all sorts of disobedient things, you know them. Or you can slam on the brakes, take a deep breath, dig deep, and say, I'm going to add obedience to this. And you return love. And you return kindness and patience and self-control. Now, does that mean you just let them mistreat you and you just, don't worry about it, I'll be loving anyway? No, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a person who's persistently showing bad behavior is to insist they stop, and that's appropriate. But you do it in a godly way. You insist they stop patiently and kindly and with self-control. Doesn't mean you just let people walk on you. You address the problem that is a genuine problem, but with self-control. And what happens when you do that? Does that immediately take all the pain away from what they did? No, you're still in pain. You're still in loss. They may not ever be able to recover that moment of hurting you. Doesn't necessarily change your spouse, but you've just shot into that dark suffering an improvement. It's getting better. It's going in a good direction now. Or with disobedience, it just goes darker. With obedience, you have hope. It's not going to be something that is just dark and miserable and terrible. It can actually move toward great good. And we get that chance every single day, just about, when you suffer. The third command that God gives to us is add obedience to your suffering. So, we have a lot of problems in this broken world, very much so. Work problems, job problems, marriage problems, economy, and the slide of our nation. And we can become sad people. We can become angry people. Or we can respond by being joyful people. And it doesn't mean that we don't have sorrows. It just means that in the midst of our sorrows and suffering, that there is a reason we have also to be joyful. And God does not just suggest that you and me do this. He commands you and me to feel joy. Because we know that great good can come if we will simply add obedience to our suffering. That's what these verses teach. And so I asked what I asked you at the beginning. Are you a person known for joy as you suffer? You'd be pretty strange if you'd say, yep, that's me. But that's what God wants. God wants us all to be able to raise our hands and say, yep, that does characterize me. That's God's goal. And it's the goal we need to shoot for. Don't dismiss this as, this is just unrealistic stuff. This is realistic stuff. That God says, I'm going to give you the power to do it. I just need you to put in the effort and the intention to do it. The first thing you need to ask, think of that think of something that you're really suffering with right now, okay? It might be a very long-term thing. It's been going on for years and you don't see any end in sight. Or it may have been something, as I said, that happened this morning. Think about that for a minute. First thing you want to ask yourself is, what do you believe about that? What do you believe about that situation? Do you believe that it's there to ruin your life? Yep, my spouse did that again and it's just ruining my life. Or no, I've got this situation going on and it's just going to ruin my life. Again, as long as you believe that about suffering, you're ever going to be a person who's joyful. You got to kill that every time that comes. You know, this happened again and now everything's ruined. No, say, this happened again, but great good can come still. The loss may never be able to recover, but I can have great good through this. You must change your definition about that. It must change from the suffering ruins my life to this suffering can create good in my life. Can you say that with me about your suffering right now? Repeat this with me. This suffering can create good in my life. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? You must believe that if you're going to obey God's command here. Then the second thing you got to do is you got to add obedience to your suffering. You have to do that. Are you adding obedience as you suffer this thing? You will have to kill disobedience every time it comes to your mind and add obedience. If you know in ways that you are responding the right way, tell God this morning, I'm sorry, I forsake that. I intend and aim to never do that again. I'll probably fail, but that's my aim. And when I do fail, I'll immediately confess it and get back on the path with you. But my intention now is for the rest of my life that every time this happens, I'm adding obedience. Will you make that commitment to God and make that intention? Oftentimes we don't do it because we just don't intend to. We just hurt and we respond in a disobedient way. But you need to hurt and then say, all right, I'm going to respond in an obedient way here. And when you do that, great good comes. And that's a reason to be joyful. Once again, these are very well-known verses, but it's not if we know them, it's if we're living them. On this Sunday before Thanksgiving, God wants us to be people who, even when we're suffering, have a reason to give thanks and be joyful. And that's why I feel God very strongly laid this on my heart to share with you this morning. Did you need to hear this? I don't think any of us finds this impractical or unhelpful. We all need to hear this on a regular basis. We're really good at changing the definition of death when we become Christians. We're not as good at changing the definition of suffering. Suffering isn't something that automatically ruins your life. Suffering brings great good if you will simply add that one ingredient of obedience every time. That's your homework. This coming week and for the rest of your life, every time you suffer, add obedience. Just do it. And everything will be able to have some hope and good involved in it. Even the darkest moments will have good if you will simply add the ingredient of obedience.